Welcome to the Brain Coffee Podcast, where doctors Eric Luthard and Albert Kim unlock life's little mysteries about health, wellness, entertainment, technology, and how the brain makes sense of it all. Sit back, relax, and open up your mind.
It's a real pleasure to have today with us at our little coffee sessions a real thought leader in brain development, Azad Bonni, Dr. Azad Bonni, who is chair of neuroscience. As an aside, I also, in some way, I'm a sort of developmental child of
right. You've developed under him.
Yeah, because I was a postdoctoral fellow in his lab maybe 10 years or more ago now, and that was a great time. So it's great to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thanks for coming. So maybe, really just to kind of frame it, we should really talk, what is developmental neurobiology? How does, when you hear those terms, what does that mean to somebody kind of like at a coffee table?
Well, I think that, it's probably good to start with the idea that most people would agree that the brain is the most complex organ in the body. It's probably more, capable than any computer. And there's great complexity in it in terms of the types of cells and so on. But it really all starts from a few cells in the human embryo, and how you go from those few cells to a very complex machine.
It's really kind of staggering when you think about it. Like a few cells divide, and then that becomes this massively complex organ that can do all the things that we do.
Right. Yeah.
So I think something, probably in terms of numbers, you could think about is, as you know, the human brain contains about 100 billion neurons and trillions and trillions of connections between these neurons. And these are not random at all, but actually quite specific. So it is a huge problem in terms of trying to understand how this machine, how it's hardwired. And that's really what brain development is about, is to understand how the brain is hardwired. And of course, layered on top of that, we want to understand how it works, and how...
I guess how it doesn't work, right?
And how it doesn't work.
Right.
And we think, from those of us who've been really focused on brain development, think that we can really bring a lot to the table in terms of understanding how the brain works, how it functions, as well as how it doesn't work in diseases, by understanding how it's put together.
I see.
What are some of the, I guess, because I actually reference this, like when we think about like our kids, and we just, I've got a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and you see kind of their development, right? You see how, like on a nearly weekly basis, how they start accumulating new information. They start, and again, it's a miracle to behold in our everyday lives.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess from a development standpoint, what are some of the fundamental things that I guess or principles of how some of this hardwiring happens?
Maybe some steps. Yeah, like maybe the major cells.
Sure.
Yeah, something like that. That would be great.
So I think that it's probably worthwhile to. This happens in every part of the brain, but we can talk about the cerebral cortex, which is this region that obviously is the most evolved in the human brain. So how do you get to that? What are some of the key steps? So a lot happens already in the embryo, in the fetus. So first of all, you have cells that are generated in a particular region during development, and from there, these cells have to move actually to their proper places where they're going to reside, and there they mature. And what that means is they forms axons and dendrites. These are the limbs of the neurons. The axons allow the neurons to, by and large, to transmit information from the center of the neuron toward other neurons, toward other nerve cells. And then dendrites are the receiving limbs of neurons. I remember that phrase you used in one of your reviews.
I used to study dendrites as well.
Right, it's kind of like, I kind of think of it in simpler terms.
They receive information.
It's like the pitcher and the catcher. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Like that basically you got the neuron, and then you've got it's maybe the team, and you got the pitcher, which is the axon, and the catcher, which is the dendrite.
Yeah.
And and the ball is the information.
That's a really good way of thinking about it. So those are formed, and then, of course, they have to make the synaptic connections. They have to actually make the connections between neurons with each other, and those are synapses. And but then a lot of other things happen too. So, for example, the axons have to become insulated with myelin, and that happens following all of these steps, generally speaking. And then, interestingly, there are an excess of nerve cells. I just said that there are 100 billion neurons, but probably twice that number are generated during development.
I think this is a really interesting concept that I think a lot of people don't know about, is that people think that more brain cells are better, and that more is always better. But as it turns out, and in fact, I think you're getting at this notion of pruning, right?
Exactly.
That basically you've got all these neurons, and then you sculpt it down to something that's highly functional. So you got this big messy blob, and then you kind of bring it down to something.
Absolutely, and that's obviously, first of all, you have excess number of neurons, so those have to be eliminated, the ones that are in excess. But there are also excess number of synapses too, and those have to be pruned. And some of the pruning is of the axons. And absolutely, that's the case. You need to sculpt it, and more isn't necessarily better, and I'll come back to that later in terms of diseases. So absolutely, you need to sculpt the number of neurons, the axons, the synapses.
Does that happen? Do the cells know to do that, or is it sort of programmed in them to make this whole brain, or is there any influence of the outside coming in?
Yeah. So the truth is, we still don't really understand why this happens and what the basis is. Why do you need so many cells? So some people think, well, there's some sort of randomness can be some randomness to the connections, to forming these connections. And so what you need is a way to make sure that only the correct connections stay. And so you need to have more cells, more synapses, so that the ones that are accurate remain. And the pruning is a way to
it's
to get,
almost
but
like
it's
this.
not really
it's like almost
clear.
like an evolution. Like you basically create like a big mess, and then you let it. Your brain essentially auto evolves to something that works as best.
The stuff that sticks, you want to keep right.
So that's one thought, but it's really not been. We still don't really understand. But maybe I'll tell you in terms of the synapses. Most people would think, well, the more synapses, the better, because then maybe you have better memory and things like that. But that's not true. In fact, we just had a study recently where we found that if we take a gene that's implicated in autism and we take that out of the brain, in this case of a mouse brain, we see that there are actually more synapses. And that is associated with impaired memory. And then what's really exciting is we looked at a number of these genes that are, in a particular class of genes, proteins. We find the same thing. So when we inhibit their function, we see more synapses. So that's a clear example of having more synapses is actually not good for you. And and we think this could be a general mechanism in autism.
So these are a group of genes involved in autism.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So this is a super interesting topic. Just a step back. Maybe not everybody knows. I don't exactly know all the details of autism, but maybe we can define autism or autism spectrum disorder.
Sure.
Yeah.
So autism, basically, these kids were described some time ago, several decades ago, as having sort of particular kind of problems. And there are a few sort of cardinal features to autism, including difficulties with social interaction. So that's one major set of problems that these kids may have. Interactions with other kids, with their parents, and so on. Another problem that they typically have is in language development, and they also have a motor component, and that is repetitive behavior. Now, there's a whole range of kids with autism. They could be actually what's called high functioning versus low functioning. And low functioning meaning that they often will have intellectual disability associated with autism.
So it's not always overlapping. It's some have
correct.
intellectual disabilities, some do
Right,
not.
right.
Okay.
I think often there is an overlap with intellectual disability, but not always.
see.
Absolutely.
And certainly people talk about people, there's people who are on autistic spectrum who have elements that are high functioning.
Sure,
That,
sure.
kind of mathematical proclivities.
Absolutely.
And,
Yeah.
or computer programming
Yeah, I mean,
skills.
we come across. I mean, in our fields, even we say, "Oh, this person or that person is on the spectrum." They could be, brilliant,
Right.
but they may
Socially,
have a few
perhaps.
social.
Well, I was going to say, like, if the
Right.
criterion for poor social interaction is a key element for autism, neurosurgery may be
It'll be very
well represented. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
so it really is a complex of
That's
disease.
right.
So
But in seriousness, though, it's even these cardinal features are really just features that there's actually a lot more to it. And if you talk to the child psychiatrists and child neurologists who see a lot of, I'm an adult neurologist. We see the kids with autism. They often talk about actually motor problems first.
Oh, interesting.
That they have a lot of motor problems, motor coordination. So they might be walking on their toes. They may be a bit clumsy. So that's actually it's quite interesting to me because I'm interested in a number of regions of the brain, but one of the regions that I'm particularly interested in have been for a while, as you know, is this hindbrain structure that's called the cerebellum, which basically stands for little brain.
Right, the back of my head.
The back of the head.
Right.
But it's interesting. We still don't really know what part of the brain really is involved in autism. There are various ideas about that. So it may be a number of areas that are involved. The cerebral cortex, which is what we talked about earlier. The cerebellum is thought to be involved as well, and also some of the other subcortical regions that are below the cerebral cortex.
And I think I want to return to the point you said earlier, which I think is a really fascinating and fundamental thing, is that in many ways, in some of the things you're seeing with the genetics, is that it's an over-connectivity problem.
Yes.
That there's too many connections leading to in some way poor informational processing or too much noise.
I would probably I think that's a good way to think about it. I probably would define it further as a disconnectivity. There may be more connections or there may be fewer connections. It's just that the balance, the right number of connections are not there in the right numbers.
Right.
So it could be
Right.
more connections, but it could also be fewer connections.
So
we just found a particular
Right.
set of genes that are similar. They all encode proteins that are involved in what we study. Albert has been studying this too, in protein turnover. And those, it turns out, it's really interesting when we inhibit those. It's quite early days,
Right.
but we see more synapses. And so I think it could. The real challenge with autism research right now is we don't really have sort of a clear path right now of what is actually happening. So we're all trying to get at this from different angles, and so it's quite a challenge. But the good news is that in the last decade, at the very least the last decade, we've learned a lot about the genetics of autism. So a lot of, in a proportion of autism cases, there are mutations of genes that have been implicated, and so that's really advanced quite well. But now the question is, what does this mean? What does it, can we get a clear picture of what the underlying pathogenic mechanisms are? What goes wrong?
Like they're not sculpting approprially, right?
Yes.
No, but we don't know what it is. That's the sort of the causal anatomic substrate.
Common? Is there a
Right.
common common pathology
Right.
in autism? We don't really know that yet, and so people are trying to get at that. Now, one possibility might be that it's really quite heterogeneous. There are all sorts of different autism.
Right, so autism is really a common description.
It's like a syndrome, I guess, as well.
But there's a number of different ways that you can get to that syndrome.
And likely syndrome. I think it's going to be, in my view, right now, what I think is going to happen is the following. I think that it's definitely the case. There are multiple different diseases that are all called right now autism, or we could call them autisms. But I think, and they each will have a different sort of process that's taking place, which means we have to understand all of them. But I think there are probably also some common pathological mechanisms, which is really important to kind of keep in mind, because it's important to figure out what those are as well, because those might allow us then to develop therapeutics, treatments that are going to work not just for one set of disorders, but multiple.
More generally.
In some senses, this shares a lot, just when I think about descriptions and terms and causes, it shares a lot with, for instance, epilepsy.
Absolutely.
So for instance, you've got epilepsy, which is having seizures on a consistent basis, but there's a lot of different causes that lead into those symptoms, and also potentially similar mechanisms as the end pathology that lead to those symptomatologies that hopefully you can get at in treating.
I think epilepsy could actually, when you mention that, could be a really great way to start thinking about autism as well, because with epilepsy we don't have cures for some of them, but for many of them, but there are ways to treat it symptomatically.
That's right.
And so with autism, we don't even really have that. So it would be nice if we could come up with, with epilepsy, we know that the nerve cells are firing excessively, abnormally. We don't really have a sense of something like that for autism that we could even in terms of symptomatic treatment. But my view, so I started out in neurology, and the reason, and then, this was a long time ago. Maybe I don't care to tell you how long ago I was doing neurology, but at the time I realized that really we don't have really good treatments. We don't have good treatments for many of them, and for actually many others we have nothing, right? So I thought it was really important to understand how the brain is put together to try to get at that. And it's really gratifying to see in the field, like as a whole, in the discipline of, in the neurosciences, I feel that brain development is actually touching all of these diseases. And there's a way to think about, how these different neurological diseases come about from a developmental perspective.
No, I think that's really interesting.
Including epilepsy, including autism, including brain tumors.
One thing, there's both treatment and there's prevention, right? And so, how can you intervene early? Now, one thing I probably, you should ask and we should bring up is I think it's controversial.
Oh, yeah.
People worry about what could quote unquote cause autism.
Yes.
And again, the elephant in the room is people talk about immunizations.
Right.
So maybe just to put it on the table, because I have my personal opinion.
And it can be super brief.
Yeah.
We don't have to get into the literature.
Exactly. What is your general thought on?
I'm really I completely agree with you, and I think this sort of definitely gets into the popular culture.
Right.
And it's a real concern because, as you know, there have been celebrities who have been promoting the idea that there's a link between vaccination and autism. But to the best of my knowledge, of what I'm aware of in terms of the literature, there's no link.
As one of the world leaders in this field.
There's no link between that, and I'm really concerned about. Of course, we know that vaccines have done wonders in terms of
saving
lives. And so I'm really worried that children are not, if they're not vaccinated because of this concern that we're going to have.
That is unfounded.
That is unfounded, absolutely. And so I would say there's no link between the two.
Right. That's good to.
Yeah, I think just to get that out there, because I was going to reduce this to somewhat more of an erudite kind of conclusion that it's complete bullshit. But I will defer to you.
No, but that's important. But how about stepping back just for a second?
Sure.
How much of it's genetic? How much of it's not thought to be genetic?
It's a very good question. I think that there's definitely, it's a fraction that's genetic. I can't give you a specific number because we're discovering Of course, there are some that are inherited.
Right.
That's a really small proportion, very, very small proportion. But we're discovering, the genetic studies, we're discovering that there are de novo new mutations, and those are still considered genetic.
Right.
So beyond that, there could well be also polygenic causes.
That'll be harder to figure out.
That it's harder to figure out. So I think it's a substantial fraction, but it's still a fraction.
Now, and not just genetics though, but also I guess theoretically, and it's probably worth introducing the concept of epigenetics.
That's right.
That it's not just your gene, whether you have a gene or not a gene, but whether a gene is modified,
regulated,
or activated or inhibited.
Right. So of course the genes are, if you take a DNA, look at DNA like a strand, and the genes are parts of the DNA, but the DNA and the proteins that basically occupy these regions are modified, they're changed. And those changes are called epigenetic. And the reason they're epigenetic because they can actually also be transmitted from the mother to the fetus. And so those are epigenetic changes. And so yes, the people are interested, for example, it's not about vaccination, but they are interested in terms of the maternal-fetal interactions, and so there is interest in the field in terms of changes that may take place in the mother and how they may be transmitted to the fetus that could lead to autism.
I think this is I think the epigenetics is really it's how environment and how
absolutely
your physiology can affect your genome and kind of what genes you turn on and off, and that kind of affects transmission of information.
Yeah, no, that's
so it's kind of different from Darwinian genetics, right?
You
could say that.
Is, yeah. And just to drive it home, just to make it a little clearer.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
we're talking epigenetics is a really huge phenomenon. I mean, we're talking about every cell in our body has the same DNA, and yet we have skin cells, brain cells, different types of brain cells.
Right.
So that's encapsulated in epigenetics. So it's a huge phenomenon for sure. But now we're drilling down on the ability of things like experience, or maybe the mom's contribution to affect the kid having autism or not. Maybe
and it's relevant also even beyond that in the kid. The kinds of experiences they may have, the kinds of environment is absolutely. It's not all about Darwin, right? So in terms of what the environment it plays an important role in the development of the child. And one thing that coming back to the development, a long time ago, people were thinking that the kid is born, development is largely done. Maybe the first year they're getting myelination and that's why they're becoming coordinated. At first, baby's not very coordinated, as you know. But after a year they're walking, and that's the end of development. But it turns out now that actually development continues in the brain. There's a lot that goes on.
Into your mid-20s, isn't that right?
Even beyond that.
Oh, that's interesting.
Up to around age 40. So maybe you guys are still there, but I'm beyond that.
I think we've just
I've now developed
the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
We've come to the other side now.
So actually what happens in terms of epigenetics, the experiences that children have could potentially have an impact on their adulthood even. So I think it's really important to consider that, and that you do need to provide the right environment as a society.
Right.
So
this is
really profound.
That's how I think about it.
No. So is there anything? Okay, short of not locking a kid in an attic forever. Are there things?
And giving him cigarettes.
Yeah. Are there positive things, that one could intuit from? I know this is super controversial. There's some people say that there's no sort of reproducible parenting mechanism that leads to a predictable outcome. I get that, but are there some principles to consider given what we know about development?
Or let's boil it down to something personal, like given everything you know, how has that influenced your parenting, or what things do you emphasize?
I want to be a little more nuanced about it.
So basically, I think of it in the following ways. I think that the brain is quite resilient. Of a normal child, it's quite resilient, but at the same time, I think environment is really critical. And I don't know. I think one particular example might be if a kid learns 2 languages, for example.
Oh yeah, this is good.
The likelihood is that it will be easier for them to learn a 3rd language. I think that there's something about, from an epigenetic standpoint, I feel, I mean, I have no evidence for this, but I feel that the epigenetics probably works there so that it keeps some of those genes open to more signals to activate that otherwise may not.
It keeps the tools available.
It keeps the tools available, sort of, and rather than closing them down and saying, okay, you don't need these genes.
We're done.
And we're done.
I see.
You're done. That it basically, and this comes to the idea of that we don't really use most. A lot of our brain is probably not used. There's lots of potential, and so I think that it would be nice if this could continue. And I have an experiment that I'm actually doing right now. I don't know if I'll be able to do it.
Is that right?
But on myself. But
I see. But you mean about critical periods?
Yes.
So, so the idea of critical periods being it's only during a certain time you can learn a certain.
Well, there's
task,
because I think it might even impact neurodegeneration later as because
you could basically bring the tools back.
I want to keep the tools open, in my brain, so that there's at least from an experiential point of view, like in terms of the environment, that I minimize the odds of having brain degeneration. Basically, it comes to the idea of use it or lose it, right? So the more that you use your brain, the better it is. And this we know, for people who are later in life, if you're not really active, actually even physically, but also mentally, if you're not active, you're more likely to succumb to the problems of dementia and age-associated brain degeneration. So I think that, unfortunately for us, we still don't really understand how these critical periods work. That's why, for example, a kid who learns languages before puberty typically will learn them well without even an accent. But later, if you learn new things, it's really hard. But I mean, it becomes really hard to learn anyway, a new language. But
now, have you ever heard of this the valproate experience and perfect pitch?
It's Takao Hensch's work.
Okay, yes.
So basically, so again, apparently there's a developmental period where you can learn perfect pitch, and once you get past that period, people can't learn perfect pitch. So what they did is they did an experiment with random adults.
Young adults,
but like 20s.
Young adults,
and they gave them valproate, and those people were able to learn perfect pitch in 2 weeks.
Or at least more than that would have.
They can't. People otherwise can't.
Right.
And so that was.
No, you're right.
That was one drug. And what I think is interesting in how this plays to kind of connectivity and plasticity, and valproate is an epilepsy drug.
Right.
And
but it has effects on epigenetics.
That's exactly right.
It's a histone deacetylase inhibitor. So basically, it leads to modifications of the epigenome that allow for the genes to become more active.
Right.
That's right.
So that's conceivable. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine that particular drug in itself would be able to do that, but I guess it needs to be
further validated.
Right. No, it's certainly intriguing because perfect pitch is supposed to stop age 5, 7, something like that. And so it is certainly intriguing to think about. And,
I do think that the brain is more plastic than we give it credit for, and that there's ways to trick it into being, again, with our experience with brain-computer interfaces, people said you couldn't recover function in stroke, 6 months after the stroke, and we have patients several years out using a brain-computer interface that then allows them to recover their hand function. And so you can do tricks, I think, to essentially allow relearning.
I think another way, in terms of, you were talking about parenting, and one of the, I don't know where you're I know 11-year-old.
I know you better.
I met her in the lab. So basically, but as your kids come to teen years, from personal experience, what I can say is that actually there's a lot that's going on in the teenage brain. And you just have to be, as a parent, I feel you have to be patient, because there's a period of turbulence, basically. And it's not just because there's a lot going on in their environment, because they're coming across, meeting other young adults and teenagers, but they might, there are actually changes that are taking place in the teenage brain.
That's really fascinating.
Oh, wow.
And it's, of course, there are also the effects of hormones, which have definitely major effects on brain development.
Right.
So what you have to remember as a parent is that you have to continue to be consistent. Which is hard to do,
Yeah.
I can assure you. But you have to be consistent in providing a positive environment. And then hope, and I think likely what happens is as they reach their early 20s, or they really change, and so it's really a positive thing, and you just hope that you come out the other end.
Yeah,
So in some senses,
that's
what
right.
again it makes me
So that's
think.
important to remember.
That's a really good point, because I think there is an emerging neuroscience of the teenage brain.
Yes.
And it makes me think of actually going back, even with early development, I feel like they're developing this chaos of behavioral and cognitive state, and then they have to resculpt to the person that they're going to be for their adult years.
Yeah.
And that requires a lot of exploration, kind of like going in different directions, opposition, and if you can provide the right framework, that eventually they sculpt to the right direction.
Right. No, I think that's good. I'm going to remember this next time I
Yeah,
maybe
right,
get a little
right.
mad at my kid.
Yeah.
That'll help me.